There's a moment in every family where you realize that the people who loved you most were the ones who never said it loudly enough. For Clara, that moment came inside a dusty garage on a dead-end street, behind a wall that nobody in her family had ever thought to look behind. But let's start from the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense without it. Henry and Evelyn Whitfield were the kind of parents that people describe as solid. Not flashy. Not the type to post about their lives or talk about their feelings over dinner. They were the type who showed up. Henry worked at the same hardware store for 30 years. Same shift, same truck, same route home. Evelyn taught elementary school until her knees gave out, then she spent her retirement tending a garden that the whole neighborhood secretly relied on for tomatoes every August. They weren't wealthy. They weren't famous. They were just decent, quiet people who built a life and raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom house that always smelled like something cooking on the stove. Those 3 children were Richard, Denise, and Clara. Richard was the eldest. Became a lawyer in Chicago. The kind of man who buttons his jacket before saying something difficult and who has a car that still smells like the dealership 2 years after buying it. Smart, driven, polished. Not unkind, exactly. Just the kind of person who learned early that distance was easier than presence. Denise was the middle child. Moved to Scottsdale, built a career in business, drove a nice car, and wore sunglasses that cost more than most people's electricity bill. She loved her parents in the way that some people love the idea of their parents, warmly, from a distance, with occasional financial gestures that felt generous to the person writing the check and quietly insufficient to everyone else. And then there was Clara. The youngest. She had moved to Asheville in her early 30s, built herself a small life. A 1-bedroom apartment. A cat she had adopted from a patient's family. A job working night shifts in the emergency room where she was good at her work in the way that only people who genuinely care about strangers can be. It wasn't a glamorous life. But it was hers, and she had made it from scratch, and there was something satisfying about that. Then, one February, her mother got a diagnosis. Alzheimer's. The neurologist delivered the news the way doctors sometimes do when they've delivered it too many times, quickly, efficiently, already reaching for the next file before Evelyn had even processed the word. Clara sat in that exam room and watched her mother smile at a poster on the wall, completely unaware that anything had changed. And Clara made a decision in that moment, the kind of decision that doesn't feel dramatic at the time but that shapes everything that comes after it. She went home. Not for a weekend. For good. She gave up her apartment in 3 days. She found someone to sublet. She packed 2 bags. She gave the cat to the neighbor who had already been feeding it half the time anyway. And she drove 4 hours to her parents' house, walked through the front door, and said 2 words that would define the next 5 years of her life. I'm here. What she walked into was hard. Her mother was standing in the kitchen in a winter coat in July, trying to microwave a can of soup without opening it. Her father was sitting at the table, staring at the can, his eyes red, his hands flat on the table like he was holding himself down. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. Nothing needed to be said. The first year was manageable. The way people describe the beginning of something they don't yet understand is going to break them. Evelyn forgot names. Mixed up dates. Left the stove on. Clara found a day shift at the county hospital 20 minutes away, came home in the evenings, cooked dinner, did the laundry, drove her mother to appointments. Her father still went to work every morning at 7, same as he had done for 30 years. Life had a shape to it, even if the shape was changing. The second year got harder. Evelyn stopped recognizing the neighbors. She called Clara by her dead aunt's name. One night she wandered out the front door at 3 in the morning in her nightgown and stood in the driveway staring up at the sky. Clara installed locks. Then alarms. She started sleeping with one ear open, listening for footsteps in the hall. By the 3rd year, Evelyn had stopped recognizing Clara at all. Who are you? Her mother asked one morning, pulling her arm away during a bath. Clara learned not to answer with the truth, because the truth only confused her. She learned to say, I'm the one who's going to help you today. And most days, Evelyn accepted that. Some days she didn't. Richard called once a month. The conversations were always the same. "How's Mom? She doesn't know who I am. That's tough." He never came. Denise sent money twice across 5 entire years. 2 checks, $500 each. Clara used the money for adult diapers and medication. Nobody offered anything else. And Clara, who had given up her apartment, her relationship, her career trajectory, her city, her independence, Clara said nothing. She didn't complain. She didn't issue ultimatums. She just kept showing up every single morning, even when her mother threw things, even when her father broke down at the kitchen table in the middle of the night, even when she herself had nothing left to give. Evelyn died on a Tuesday in March. Quietly, in her own bed, with Clara on one side and Henry on the other. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. Clara nodded and didn't say what she was thinking, which was that peaceful felt like a strange word to use for the end of a mind that had been disappearing piece by piece for 4 years. 4 months later, Henry was gone too. A stroke. Clara found him on the floor of a garage on Miller Street, slumped against his workbench with sawdust still on his shirt and a pencil in his hand. The paramedics said he was gone before he hit the ground. She rode in the ambulance anyway. She held his hand the whole way. His fingers were rough and thick with calluses. The hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life. Richard flew in for the funeral. Denise drove up from Scottsdale. They wore black and said the right things to the right people and shook hands with neighbors they didn't recognize. They left within 48 hours. And then Clara was alone in a house that still smelled like both of her parents, with 5 years of her life behind her and nothing visible to show for it. 3 months after her parents died, Clara sat in a lawyer's office with her siblings. The lawyer's name was Webb, and he had handled both estates, and he had known Henry Whitfield for 15 years. He opened a manila folder, set his glasses on his nose, and began to read. Richard received the house. 4 bedrooms, the yard their mother had tended for decades, the driveway where their father had parked the same truck for 20 years. Richard nodded once and said that made sense, because he was the eldest. Nobody asked if it made sense to anyone else. Denise received the savings account, $41,000, and a sedan with 60,000 miles on it. She uncrossed her legs and said, "Okay." Then Webb paused. He looked at Clara over the rim of his glasses, and something in his expression shifted, a hesitation she couldn't quite name. He read aloud. "To my daughter Clara, I leave the detached garage located at 14 Miller Street. Appraised value, $10. $10. 5 years of her life. Her apartment. Her relationship. Her career. Her cat. 4 years of bathing her mother and holding her father's hand through the worst nights of his life. And she got a garage worth $10. Richard stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said it was what their father wanted. Denise said she was sure he had his reasons. They walked out together, talking quietly about flights. Clara stayed in her chair and listened to their footsteps disappear down the stairs. Webb waited until the hallway was silent. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He said something Clara didn't quite understand at the time. "Each child receives what they need. That's how your father put it to me." Clara didn't know what that meant. Not yet. Outside, Denise was waiting by her car. She suggested, gently, that their father perhaps hadn't been himself at the end. That the confusion and the forgetfulness had affected his judgment. "He wrote this will 8 months before he died," Clara told her. "He knew exactly who he was. He just wasn't who you wanted him to be." Denise opened her mouth, closed it, and drove away. Clara didn't go to the garage right away. She told herself she was busy. She told herself it was just a garage on a dead-end street. A $10 appraisal. What could possibly be inside? But the house kept getting quieter, and the silence kept pressing in, and after 2 weeks she got in her car and drove over anyway. Because the garage was the last thing that still felt connected to her father. Miller Street was 3 blocks from the hardware store, on the far side of the railroad tracks. Clara had been there as a small child. Henry used to bring her on Saturday mornings. She'd sit in the truck with a juice box and a coloring book while he disappeared inside for an hour, sometimes 2. Then he'd come out smelling like sawdust and take her for ice cream. She'd asked him once what he did in there. He said, "Just tinkering, bug. A man needs a place to think." She'd never questioned it. Children accept the rhythms of their parents' lives without asking why. It's only later, when there's no one left to ask, that you realize how much you never knew. The garage was exactly as she remembered it. Gray cinder block. Flat roof. A metal rolling door rusted along the bottom. She pulled out the key the lawyer had given her and opened the padlock. It turned smoothly. Someone had oiled it recently. The smell hit her before anything else could. Sawdust and linseed oil, thick enough to taste. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The workbench ran the entire length of the left wall, 8 feet of solid wood, worn smooth by years of use. Above it, a pegboard covered in hand tools arranged in careful rows, each one hanging inside its own outline traced in black marker. Nothing missing. Nothing out of place. Clara walked to the bench and ran her hand across the surface. She could feel marks in the grain, impressions left behind by decades of work she had never known was happening. Lumber was stacked against the back wall, boards of different widths organized by type, some wrapped in clear plastic. She had always assumed this was all her father did in here. A little sawing. Some sanding. A quiet man's quiet hobby. Then she saw it. Behind the lumber, where the wall should have been flat cinder block, there was a vertical seam. A line running from floor to ceiling, almost invisible, painted over in the same gray as the rest of the wall. She pulled 2 boards aside and leaned closer. A door. No handle. Just a small brass keyhole set flush with the surface. Her hands were trembling. She searched the workbench drawer by drawer until, in the back of the center drawer, taped flat against the underside of the wood, she found a small brass key. The teeth were worn smooth from years of use. She pressed it into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it and the door swung inward. The room on the other side was twice the size of the workshop. Her father had built it into the space behind the garage, extending into what she'd always assumed was an empty lot next door. A high window she had never noticed from the outside let in a wide column of morning light. And in that light, standing quiet and still, was furniture. A dining table with hand-carved legs. 6 chairs arranged around it, each one slightly different in design but all clearly made by the same careful hands. A bookshelf tall enough to reach the ceiling, with shelves of different heights and panels so smooth they caught the morning light like glass. A bed frame with a headboard carved from a single wide piece of dark walnut. A rocking chair with armrests worn to a silky shine. A writing desk with dovetailed drawers and small brass pulls that matched the key she just used on the hidden door. Every single piece had a small paper tag hanging from a length of cotton string. Clara walked to the dining table and turned the tag over. Her father's handwriting. Steady and sure, even at the end of his life. For Clara. She turned to the rocking chair. For Clara. The bookshelf. For Clara. The bed frame. The desk. Every last piece. All for Clara. She sat down on the floor right there and leaned her back against the table leg and looked around at the room her father had built in secret. Around her, in the morning light, 40 years of work sat waiting with her name on it. She stayed there for a long time. Eventually she stood, wiped her face, and began to look more carefully. On the writing desk she found, in the top drawer, a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn soft from handling. She opened to the first page. H. Miller Furniture Journal, Volume 1. The first entry was dated 38 years ago. A sketch of a simple side table. Notes in the margins about wood grain and the best time to let oak season. She kept turning pages. The entries went on for decades. Dense notes and careful sketches. Joinery techniques. Wood sources. Finishing methods. And at the bottom of most pages, a name and a dollar amount. Sold to Leland. $8,000. Sold to Leland. $12,000. Again and again. Leland. A dealer. A man who handled the selling. Henry Whitfield, the man who had gone to work at a hardware store every single morning for 30 years, had been building and selling museum-quality furniture under a name his own family had never heard. The name was H.W. Miller. HW for Henry William. Miller for Evelyn's maiden name. He had named his secret life after himself and his wife. Clara found the bank book beneath the journal in the same drawer. The last entry, updated 7 months before her father died, showed a balance of over $340,000. The account was listed under 2 names: Henry W. Whitfield and Clara E. Whitfield. He had walked into a bank at some point, without telling anyone, and put her name on the account. He had been depositing money from his furniture sales for decades, building something for her so slowly and so quietly that nobody had ever suspected a thing. She called Walt Petton from the garage. Walt answered on the second ring, steady and unsurprised. He said he had been wondering when she would call. He showed up in 8 minutes. Walt was 68 years old and had run the hardware store since his own father retired. He had given Henry Whitfield a job behind the counter before Clara was born. He came through the garage door with a canvas bag over his shoulder and stopped when he saw the hidden room standing open. Clara asked why he hadn't told her. Walt said Henry had made him promise not to. 30 years, he said. He wasn't going to break his word the week the man died. Walt sat in one of the dining chairs and told her the whole story. Henry had started building furniture in his 20s. Small things at first, side tables, cutting boards, pieces he gave away. He wasn't trained. He learned from library books, and by making mistakes, and by fixing those mistakes. But he had something most people don't. He had patience. The real kind. The kind where you spend 3 weeks on a single joint because you know it matters. By the time Henry was 35, Walt said, he was building at a level most trained professionals never reach. He would stay late at the store 3 nights a week. Walt had assumed he was avoiding going home. He wasn't. He was coming here. Henry had found a dealer in Raleigh named Leland Cross. A quiet man who handled galleries and private collectors. Henry would build a piece, drive it down, hand it over. Leland did the rest. Exhibitions, collectors, shipping, everything. Henry never met a single buyer. Nobody ever figured out who H.W. Miller really was. That was the whole point. Leland knew. Walt knew. Beyond that, nobody. Walt reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a glossy catalog. Heavy paper, the kind you find on gallery tables in cities where people pay $30,000 for a rocking chair. The cover read, H.W. Miller, 40 Years of American Craft. Clara opened it. Photographs of furniture she recognized. The dining table she was standing next to. A desk nearly identical to the one in the corner. A rocking chair with the same curved armrests. Each piece photographed beautifully in a gallery setting, with a small card listing dimensions and estimated value. $15,000. $22,000. $38,000. Her father was famous. In certain circles, collectors, woodworking journals, gallery owners, H.W. Miller was a recognized name. People had written about his work for decades. But nobody knew the man behind it. Clara asked why. Why hide something this significant for your entire life? Walt leaned forward and was quiet for a moment, the way her father used to be quiet before he said something that mattered. Then he said, your father saw things, Clara. He saw how Richard treated money. He saw how Denise handled obligation. And he saw what you gave up when you moved home. He watched you give everything to your mother and never once ask for credit. About 10 years ago, Walt told her, Henry had sat him down after closing and said he was worried. He'd been putting money aside for years. Good money. And he was afraid that if Richard or Denise ever found out, they'd come after it. Family pressure. Legal action. Inheritance fights. He had seen it destroy other families. So he kept it hidden. The furniture. The account. The journal. All behind a door nobody knew about, in a garage nobody wanted, with a $10 appraisal he had personally arranged with the county to keep it looking worthless. He was the smartest man I ever knew, Walt said. People just didn't see it because he was quiet about it. After Walt left, Clara spent another hour alone in the room. She read more of the journal. She opened drawers. She touched surfaces her father had shaped and smoothed over the course of a life. Then her phone rang. It was Richard. His voice was light and casual, just a quick question about the garage. What was in there? Sawdust, she told him. Some old tools. Nothing worth a trip. He didn't believe her. 3 days later he called again and said he was coming that weekend. Denise was flying in. Clara spent Friday evening in the rocking chair thinking about what to do. She could lock the hidden door, hide the key, deny everything. Richard would come back. He'd hire an inspector. He'd petition a court if he had to. That was how he operated. But there was another part of it, a part she wasn't entirely proud of. She wanted him to see it. She wanted her brother to stand in that room and look at what their father had built in the dark while Richard was in Chicago billing $400 an hour and not returning his mother's calls. On Saturday morning, Clara got to the garage early. She unlocked everything and waited. Richard arrived on time in a sport coat and leather shoes. Denise was with him, purse over her shoulder, sunglasses pushed up on her head. Clara led them through the workshop and opened the hidden door. The room filled with gray morning light. The furniture stood where it always stood. Richard stepped through and she watched the calculation begin behind his eyes. He found the writing desk. Opened the drawers without asking. Found the journal. Then found the bank book. He read the balance, set the book down, and looked at her. $340,000. And you weren't going to tell us? Clara told him she had told him what she was ready to tell him. Richard straightened his jacket and said this needed to be discussed. That these assets couldn't just go to one person. That the will didn't say anything about a hidden room full of collector-grade furniture and a joint savings account bigger than the house they inherited. Clara said the will said the garage and its contents, and if he wasn't sure, he could ask Webb, who she had already called. There was a pause in Richard's argument. He asked why their father would do this. Why hide something this big for his entire life? Clara reached into her jacket and placed a sealed letter on the desk between them. Henry had written it for both of them. Denise opened it. She read the first few lines aloud and then stopped and read the rest silently, her lips barely moving. When she finished, she passed it to Richard without looking at him. Her face had gone white. Henry's letter was plain and unhurried. He had written it the way he had always spoken, without decoration, without raising his voice. It began and ended with the same words, "I love you both." Between those two lines, he told them the truth. He wrote about the weekly calls Richard had answered half the time. About the 2 checks Denise had sent over 5 years, and what Clara had spent that money on. About every morning Clara had gotten up and done the things they should have been there to do. About Daniel, the man who had been going to ask Clara to marry him, who had come to the house in April and talked with her in the driveway for 20 minutes and then driven away and never come back, because Clara had chosen her mother over her own future. Henry had watched that conversation from the window. He had never said a word about it. But he had seen it. The letter said he wasn't angry. He understood they had their own lives. But Clara was there. Clara was there every single day. And the last line said, "I hope you understand why I did what I did. If you don't understand now, read this letter again in 5 years." Richard set the letter on the desk and stared at the wall for a long moment. When he spoke again, the anger was gone. His voice was smaller. He said he wasn't going to file a challenge. The joint account was outside the estate anyway, and the codicil his father had filed 2 years earlier with a separate attorney and a county notary was legally airtight. But that wasn't why he was standing down. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked at his sister. "I should have come home," he said. His voice caught on the last word. "Yeah," Clara said. "You should have." He walked out slowly. His footsteps were different from the first time he'd left this building. Denise stayed. She sat at the dining table for a while longer and squeezed Clara's hand before she left. "He saw us," Denise said. "He saw exactly who we were and still signed the letter, Dad." "That's who he was," Clara said. But the story wasn't finished yet. Before Walt had left the garage on that first day, he had mentioned an envelope. Henry had given it to him 2 years before he died, sealed, with instructions not to open it and not to hand it to Clara until she had found the room on her own. He'd said, "If she doesn't look, she's not the person I think she is." Clara went to the hardware store that evening. Walt reached into the bottom drawer of the old green filing cabinet and pulled out a thick manila envelope with her father's handwriting on the front. She broke the seal and found 3 things inside. A legal document, a codicil to the will, notarized and witnessed, granting her sole and exclusive ownership of everything in the garage. An unsealed letter addressed to Richard and Denise. And a letter addressed to Clara. She opened her own letter last. Her father told her he was sorry he hadn't been able to say any of it while he was alive. He said there were nights when she was sitting with her mother in the next room and he had almost walked in and told her everything. But he needed to make sure it was protected first. Her brother was a lawyer. Her sister knew how to make a claim. He had to build a wall around what he was building before he could rest. And then he said the thing Clara had been carrying for 5 years without anyone ever saying it out loud. I see you, Clara. I have always seen you. You stayed when it cost you everything, and you never once asked for anything in return. And then there were the birthday letters. Hidden in a false bottom in the writing desk drawer, a thin groove in the wood that she almost missed entirely. 4 envelopes. Clara at 10, Clara at 20, Clara at 30, Clara at 40. Each one written on her birthday, in the years before she ever knew any of this room existed. The letter from her 10th birthday described a moment in a school parking lot. Henry had been waiting to pick her up. Through the fence, he watched her sitting on a bench at lunch when a boy sat down next to her, a boy with no lunch bag, who didn't ask for anything. She looked at him, looked at her sandwich, and tore it in half. She handed him the bigger piece and said, "Sure." When he thanked her, she didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. She just did it. "That's when I knew what kind of person you were going to be," Henry wrote. At 20, he wrote about the day she sat at the kitchen table and told the family she was going to be a nurse. Her brother was in law school. Her sister was studying business. Both looked better on paper. But Clara's face had been so certain about what she wanted to do, take care of people, that Henry had to leave the room before she could see him cry. At 30, he wrote about Daniel. About the ring box he had seen in Daniel's coat pocket at Christmas. About watching Clara choose her mother without ever explaining it to anyone, without asking anyone to notice, without giving herself any credit for what it cost. And at 40, the last letter, written while she was still in the house, still bathing her mother, still getting up every single morning, he wrote that he saw her. That he had always seen her. That the garage, the room, everything he had built in secret, was hers. That it was always going to be hers. That he had just needed time to finish it. 6 months later, Clara moved into a craftsman cottage on the west side of town. She furnished it entirely with her father's pieces. The dining table in the center of the kitchen. 5 of the 6 chairs around it, she kept the 6th at the workshop. The bookshelf filled with boxes of books she had packed when she left Asheville and never opened since. The bed frame with the walnut headboard. The writing desk by the window in the spare room, with the birthday letters safe in the false bottom of the drawer. The rocking chair by the front window where the evening light was best. The garage on Miller Street stayed where it was. Clara cleaned the workshop, oiled every tool on the pegboard, replaced the overhead light, and hung a wooden sign above the door. She used her father's real name. The Henry Whitfield Workshop. The secret had served its purpose. There was no reason to keep it anymore. She taught her first woodworking class on a Saturday in September. 4 people showed up. By the 3rd week there were 9. By October she was running 2 sessions every Saturday with a waiting list. She didn't charge anything. Her father had spent 40 years building things in the dark, and something about putting a price on the space felt wrong to her. The hardware store donated scrap wood. A lumber yard sent offcuts once a month. People came because they wanted to build things, or because they wanted to be around people who were building things, or because they just needed somewhere to be on a Saturday morning that wasn't their own kitchen. One Tuesday in November, a young woman appeared in the workshop doorway. Jeans, gray sweatshirt, hair pulled back. She stood watching the afternoon class for 10 minutes before Clara noticed her. She said she'd seen the sign and didn't know anything about woodworking. She also said, quietly, that she had just left her husband. Clara recognized the posture. The careful way she held herself. The practiced sentence. She had seen it too many times in the ER. "We're building bookshelves this week," Clara said. "Come in. Start with the joints. Everything else follows from there." The woman's bookshelf took 3 weeks. The joints were uneven and the shelves wobbled a little. But it held. 3 weeks after that, she had a job helping run the workshop and a deposit saved for a studio apartment. She sent Clara a photo of the bookshelf against the wall of her new place. "The joints are crooked," the text said. "But it holds." Clara wrote back, "That's all it needs to do." Richard called on a Sunday morning in March. He said he'd been in town for a deposition and had driven past the old house on his way to the airport. Different curtains in the windows. Smaller somehow. Then he said 2 words, plainly, with no additional explanation. "I'm sorry." Clara said thank you. He asked about the workshop, and she told him they'd had 14 people the previous Saturday. He said that was really good. He asked if he could visit sometime. She said he could. He said he'd like that. She didn't know if he'd come. Maybe he would, and maybe he'd get busy and let it slide the way he always had. But the words were there. The door was open. A letter from Denise arrived that same week. Handwritten, on plain white paper. She said she had read their father's letter 5 times. That every time she got to the part about the 2 checks, she had to put it down and walk around for a while before she could pick it up again. She said she wasn't asking Clara to forgive her. She was just saying what was true. "You were there. I wasn't. If you ever want to talk, I'm here now." Clara folded the letter and put it in the writing desk drawer, next to the birthday letters. That evening she sat in the rocking chair by the front window and watched the last of the daylight fall across the bookshelf and the floor. She held the 4 birthday envelopes in her lap without opening them. She thought about her father. The man who brought her to the garage on Saturday mornings and let her sit in the truck with a juice box while he went inside and built something enormous in complete silence for 40 years. The man who said just tinkering, bug. The man who watched a 10-year-old girl tear her sandwich in half for a boy who had nothing and went home that evening and started writing her letters. The man who spent his whole life building things for the people he loved and never once needed anyone to know. Outside, the last light faded. Inside, the house went quiet. Clara closed her eyes and let the chair rock her. Her father had always known what he was doing. He had just needed time to finish it. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.